series of Needle on Skin at the National Maritime Museum Greenwich. With the knowledgeable help from my guests, we'll be taking a look at the connection tattoos have to tradition, culture, and identity. So, can tattooing inform us about our society as much as any object or artwork in a museum? This session is Tattoos a la Mode and takes a deep dive into the relationship between tattoos and fashion. I am so delighted to welcome Amber Butchart. She's dress historian, author, and broadcaster who specializes in the intersections between politics, clothing, and culture. And of course, welcome back to our go-to guys for all things tattooing, Dr. Matt Lodder, Senior Lecturer in Art History and Theory and Director of American Studies at the University of Essex. Hi guys. Just before we begin, if you haven't done this before, if you have any comments or questions, please type them in, whatever they are, into the comments or the question box. And also, you may not see her, but working on all this Zoom things this evening is my colleague Shahiri. So thanks, Shahiri. Okay, well, welcome. It's lovely to meet you both. And you again, Matt.
Hello.
And you for the first time, Amber. Like I said, I'm loving the background there, Matt, really.
Yeah, although I've noticed, right, like this is probably like tattooed arms because it thinks that my arm is part of the background. It doesn't recognize it as skin.
It's blending
in.
You're blending into your background, very chameleon-like. So so we're going to get started straight away. And basically, my first question to both of you is, are tattoos fashion, and are both used to signify the same things?
I think Amber should start on that because she's the fashion historian.
Well, are tattoos fashion? Yes, I think yes. If we're taking a sort of definition of fashion, which is using your body essentially as a means of visual communication, visual expression, then yes, I think tattoos fit into that. We also, of course, see fashions for different types of tattoos, as, I'm sure Matt could speak about this a lot more than me, but, anybody who remembers the sort of proliferation of awful faux Celtic designs in the 90s, or, bad like Chinese script, things like that, also in the 90s, we'll be aware that the actual tattoos go in fashions as well. They adorn the body. I think you could describe them as a type of permanent fashion.
Anything to add on that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, like what I find super interesting about all this is that tattooing is just, it's quite an obvious thing to say really, but it's not something that often gets pointed out, that tattooing is just really connected to the visual cultures from which it emerges, right? So people, and I've said this a lot in other places, like tattooing relates to the images around the people who are acquiring the tattoos. And so like there's this really amazing continuity between the images people get tattooed on their bodies and the images they wear on their clothing and the images they consume or use or display in other ways. And I think that's just a really useful way to think about tattooing. And tattooing, as Amber said, as a fashion, and tattooing used in fashion are two sort of sides of the same coin. I know we're going to talk about both of those things tonight. Because on the one hand, tattooing is certainly Western tattooing has really always been described since there has been a professional tattoo industry as like the brand new fashion. Everyone's doing it, tattooing a la mode. And all through that period, the images that people have been getting tattooed on them have been, in some senses, kind of echoing the images in other media, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's like when we spoke before, you were saying about how the sailors, when they did the scrimshaw and their own tattoos, were really reflective of what they were seeing, what they were feeling. It's the same thing. Like when, as Amber said, the different, tattoos, different styles of tattoos go in and out of fashion. So, and that's just reflective of what people are seeing. Like you said, there were some pretty bad ones in the 90s there for a while. And also that thing of people getting things tattooed in them, which didn't necessarily reflect their culture. So they could get Chinese writing and they didn't know what it meant, what it said, or things like that. So yeah. I guess going back, if we have a look at some of the slides, you're going to take back to some really interesting things, that this has always been the case, that there has always been tattooing. There is always reflected in fashion and tattoos. So if we take a look, Shahiri, if you could share the first image, please.
Here we go.
Okay. And the next one, actually, that's the one.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to that literally first and go back one more, Shahira. Yeah, I mean, like, this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? Like, this is from the 1870s, right? Tattooing amongst fashionable folk. So 150 odd years ago, just a bit under that. This metropolis is addicted to short-lived hobbies. The latest fashionable fancy is, I discovered a day before yesterday, it is tattooing. Some 3 years ago, it had a brief existence, so brief it never mattered anything. Now it will come back, right? And I think we have this sense that tattooing as fashion is a kind of very recent thing, or that tattooing being fashionable is a recent thing. And of course, like, things have changed since the 1870s. But this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? The idea of tattooing and fashion is intertwined has been a very old idea. And, you know, so yeah, if you go on to the next slide, we can find, you know, this is kind of what I was talking about with tattooing reflecting designs that people consume in other ways or wear in other ways. This is 4th century BCE image from a Greek pot, a crater depicting a Thracian woman, or actually a group of Thracian women, who were tattooed. And it's just such an incredible image, because you can see like this kind of almost translucently rendered skirt with the tattooed limb kind of underneath it, and those tattoos on the legs and on the upper arms there, like really kind of echoing the patterns that are on the clothing. And we see that a lot in Greek depictions of Thracians and actually of other tattooed peoples they encountered. You know, there's this really kind of straightforward connection between the iconography of textiles and the iconography of tattooing, you know, right the way back, you know, over 2,000 years, more than that.
I mean, you can see as well in this picture, in this image, that around the end of the skirts and also on the top of the arm of the main picture, it's very reminiscent of Greek architecture as well. That kind of shape or that design comes up quite often.
Yeah, look, so tattooing is, you know, tattooing, like all cultural forms, is kind of very taste dependent. The art historian Heinrich Wolfin once said, you know, that in the Gothic period, when all the churches were spiky, everyone wore pointy shoes. And of course, there's also kind of cultural influence as well, right? So the Greeks actually weren't tattooed particularly. They did use tattooing in like penal senses, but they certainly kind of wrote about and, you know, sort of reluctantly admired tattooing on their Thracian and Scythian and Samaritan neighbors. And there's this, and this goes all the way across the world essentially in this period, where there's this, you know, almost kind of relationship, and we'll talk about some more later on as well, between the images that people are, you know, seeing in other cultures actually, and tattooing on their bodies or embroidering on their clothing.
Isn't it sort of human nature really to use clothing and tattoos as adornment? I mean, that's just been going on for millennia, that it's an adornment for us.
Totally, yeah, definitely. I'm currently doing some work for a project for the British Textile Biennial, which is happening up in Lancashire next month. So I'm doing a lot of research into textiles, printing methods, weaving, anything and everything you can think of to do with textiles, really. And something I say a lot as a dress historian in terms of the fashion industry in which, or the fashion culture in which we live now, most of us in the Western world especially, is that we're so completely divorced from the means of production. We've completely lost all sense of the amount of labor that goes into creating textiles and then creating the clothes that are made from these textiles. And the reason I'm saying that is because different methods of dyeing, different methods of pattern making, whether it's resist printing, embroidery, all of these different techniques are so time consuming. The only reason humans do it and have been doing it since the dawn of humanity is a love of adornment. And that's why I'm constantly surprised by the sort of constant denigration that fashion studies tends to come up against in popular culture, and sometimes still in academia as well, because there is so much work and labor and ingenuity throughout human history that has gone into the creation of textiles purely because people love to adorn themselves. There's no, you know, you could very easily weave cloth and keep it plain, but nobody wants to do that. I mean, look at the incredible decoration here. I absolutely love this image. And like you say, Matt, the synchronicity there between the adornment on the skin and the adornment on the textiles. And again, that's just all part of this process. We love to adorn our bodies. We really do, even though we seem to deny it constantly as well.
Yeah, and what I think super interesting about this as well, this is actually not my observation myself, but these are people that the Greeks thought were kind of barbarians and savages, right? So there's a sort of weird or quite kind of deferential appreciation going on here as well in the depiction of this, because the tattooing for the Greeks, you know, on their neighboring cultures was sort of really seen as a sign of primitiveness or non-Greekness. And yet you can see with sort of how delicately even these dresses are rendered that there is a kind of admiration going on here for the aesthetic, you know, beauty, as Amber was saying, on these kind of textiles, even when the sort of point of these images is to sort of try and present this culture as sort of different from your own, or you know, lesser than your own in some senses.
But I guess that's also quite a human thing to do. We kind of venerate things, even when we put them down, we kind of like go and put them in the exotic box or this and that. And like, maybe there's a certain, almost not jealousy, but like enviousness that we would like to do it. So we shun it or we denigrate it because it's something we like to do, but maybe in our society or how we live, it's not acceptable. So acceptable.
Yeah, sorry, Emma, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I was just going to say that, you know, tattooing is always this way of, like, everyone thinks that everyone else is tattooed, right? So like the Chinese were like, we haven't got tattoos. It's all those strange tribes to the north. The Greeks were like, we haven't got tattoos. It's all those strange tribes to the east. The Brits were like, we're not tattooed. You know, everyone thinks that tattooing is from somewhere else, but basically tattooing is from everywhere. And I think that's what's super interesting. And I think that's probably true of fashion more generally, right? Like everywhere else is exotic and strange, but of course, that strangeness works in both directions, you know.
Of course it does. Amber, did you want to add to that?
I actually can't remember what I was going to say, but one thing I was thinking earlier when you were discussing this image, Matt, and I think it's probably because it's of the way the image is rendered, but it also makes me think of henna, and the actual textile designs here also are slightly reminiscent of some of the chintz, the Indian textiles that I've been looking at recently also. Is India a big influence on this, on sort of Thracian culture?
Yes, well, there's this kind of, they're basically on this kind of trade route that goes all the way to China and India. So there's lots of kind of cultural crossing. Like henna's another story entirely, because henna also, everyone thinks it's from everywhere else. I've got a PhD student at the moment, Wada Al-Saderi, working on a history of henna, which is even harder than a history of tattooing, because at least some of my stuff survives through time, like no preserved henna, you know, really survives. So there's this absolute kind of this cultural transmission, essentially, more of design than of technique, right? Tattooing as a practice seems to be pretty universal, but it's the designs that vary from culture to culture.
Shahiri, can we see the next image, please? Because this is amazing. Tell us about this, Matt.
So this is another kind of similar culture to the Thracians, who were also kind of fighting the Greeks a lot. If anyone's seen Game of Thrones, the Scythians and the Pazyryks, who are a particular group of Scythians from Siberia, are basically the cultural traditions that the Dothraki were based on. These horse riding kind of warriors, basically nomadic warriors from across the Russian steppes, all the way from like the eastern edges of the Baltic all the way through to the borders of China and Mongolia. And this is a woman of Pazyryk origin from the Altai Mountains, from around about the same period as that Thracian vase, from about 277 BCE. Remarkably preserved in the permafrost, so sort of dug up in the 90s initially, and there are 7 Pazyryk bodies yet discovered, preserved in the ice of the Siberian permafrost. And every Pazyryk we found, man and woman, high status, low status. I mean, it's a small number, only 7 have been found, but every single one of them has been tattooed, many of them with very similar images to each other. And in fact, there is also some good evidence that many of the bodies we found were tattooed by the same person. So it's like the longest surviving designs. And you can see on her shoulder there, she's got this kind of griffin thing, which is like kind of a griffin horse. And then on her lower arm, she's got more beasts further down, and her fingers are tattooed as well. These kind of images are very common in Pazyryk and Scythian cultures. They were trading with China and wore embroidered silks, but they also had very tooled leather work, amazing jewelry, lots of gold and bronze because they didn't have any iron, all of which bears very similar imagery. Most anthropologists of this culture think that there are particular kind of symbolic, kind of almost like textual iconographic meanings to these images that we can't know what they are, unfortunately. But the point of including it here today is that if we go to the next slide, you'll see the images in Pazyryk tattooing, and here's on the left this lady, she's known as the Uruk Ice Princess, and on the right is a man from the same culture. You can see like real similarities in the designs between like their carpets. This is the Pazyryk carpet, which has been discovered, and also things like horse brasses and decorative bronze objects for horse tethering, because the high status individuals in this culture were buried with sacrificial horses in full regalia. So there's a lot of amazing stuff. But the images, not just the images, the style, I think that's also really interesting. The style of depiction of real and fantastical beasts is entirely continuous across tattoo designs and other forms of, clothing and objects.
I mean, it's incredible because when you look at the 2 pictures here of the bodies, the full sleeves, the leg tattoo as well is totally like you'd see someone walking out today. They have their pretty on, or David Beckham, or they're going to you just see it so much. So like in some ways nothing has changed. I love the horse motif as well, like animals as well. They are a constant in tattooing. We see them, however the styles change, we always see that, and we see it a lot of materials, which we haven't got the slide on this slideshow, but one of the other Pazyryk female mummies has got a forearm piece of like leopards fighting these deer things. So the same kind of thing that appear in Chinese art, in Japanese art, in tattooing still today, this kind of like sort of like battle royale, fight to the death kind of imagery, like that's being tattooed on Scythians, in amazing kind of detail and beautiful, fitted to the body. These were probably drawn before they were tattooed, so that they may have even come from kind of flash designs 2,500 years ago.
Do you know anything about the technique of how these tattoos were done?
So most European tattooing is done in a pretty straightforward way. It's just kind of needles poked in the skin. We haven't found any Scythian tattooing kits, but there is one amazing article by a guy called Jablonski on tattoo tools from the Samaritans, which is another, you've heard them from the Bible, another kind of adjacent culture. There's lots of tattooing across the kind of Central Europe and the that part of the world in this period of time. And basically, you know, we're talking bronze needles probably, pricked in with a carbon-based sort of, you know, carbon soot-based ink.
Were they
it's interesting.
Sorry, go on, Amber.
I mean, it's just interesting that even that we use the same word, isn't it, for skin as we do for cloth, the needle. Even though they're technically slightly different tools, you know, a needle that you would obviously thread for cloth, you wouldn't necessarily need the eye of the needle on a needle that you'd use for tattooing, but we even, you know, it's the same word, which is quite an interesting link.
Yeah, and that's actually proved a bit of a problem for tattoo historians and anthropologists over the years, because things that, you know, have been catalogued as sewing needles or medicinal, you know, acupuncture tools or something, maybe tattooing implements after all. There's work by a friend of mine called Aaron Dieter Wolf, who works in Native American tattooing, who's kind of figured out how to tell the difference between needles used for tattooing. That culture uses bones and bone needles made out of turkey bones, to tell the difference under a microscope between needles used for tattooing and needles used for leather work or other kinds of textile work. And that's real cutting edge work being done with kind of microscopy. And there is a culture, you know, lots of actual sailors, which we'll come on to, were using just normal sewing needles to tattoo themselves. And there are tattooing traditions across the Arctic, for example, where particular kinds of tattoos are done by sewing thread through the skin, or pulling a kind of ink laden sinew or thread through the skin to leave marks. So there's lots of really interesting crossovers technique wise as well.
There's a performance artist and a textile artist that I'm working with actually on this biennial, called Raisa Kabir, who does really fantastic work about sort of Indian textiles and colonialism and the links to Britain and things like that. And part of her performance work, she actually stitches into her body as live performance pieces, and she also does sort of live backstrap loom weaving as well. So in her work, I'll send I can send over a link to her actually if anyone's interested. She kind of is I guess that exact same, like sewing on the body, sewing cloth, it's all sort of interlinked I guess in her work.
Just on that, Amber, what kind of things does she embroider or sew onto? Does she make designs, or are they words, or?
Well, there's into her skin, when she's sewing into her skin. For that, I think it's just temporary. I think she does the soles of her feet, things like that, you know, it's not like she's doing really thin, you know, bits of skin that are gonna be really incredibly painful. So I think it's just sort of small marks. It would be interesting actually to see if what she does has any link to any sort of tattoo culture anywhere. I'll ask her. I'll be seeing her next month, so I'll ask her and I'll feed back to you all.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's also interesting, Matt, that you said that they could tell that it's from one tattooist. So obviously that person has been incredibly busy making lots of money.
Well, this is the theory. So it's because they're stylistically very similar, and the mummies are they're carbon dated, and the kurgans, the barrows in which they're buried, are dated to very similar dates. So it can't prove that, but that is a prevailing theory amongst the specialists who work on this stuff. I just think that's just beautiful, you know, that one tattooer has at least 5 or 6 pieces of work surviving 2,500 years.
I know. I was thinking while you were saying about the permafrost and just climate change, I hope that doesn't disappear and that they can find more bodies. That's a whole nother talk. It's a very long and complicated issue. It sure is. So I was going to go on to the next slide and sort of ask this is interesting bit tell us about this?
Yeah, these are some more of these headlines from we're talking about the first. This is from the 1930s. You know, tattooing a la mode, which we use for our title today. Fashions changed in tattooing. Sailors amongst civilized people were once the chief patrons of the art. Now it appears American youths have pictures of feminine film stars. I mean, again, I do a whole talk on this. You still see headlines saying this today. You know, in some senses, it's sort of the premise of our talk today. You know, tattooing is now fashionable. It used to be this subcultural thing, and like this is 100 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, journalists are quite lazy sometimes with that kind of thing, especially when it's about tattooing. Especially if they don't like it, like we spoke before about was it Tony Parsons, who really hates tattoos, so he always says the same things. So in what sort of decades do we start seeing tattoos being incorporated into mainstream fashion?
So what have we got next? So if we go to the next slides, here we go. I've talked a lot, so I'll let Amber talk about this.
Well, I mean, you should probably talk about this, Matt, because I know you've been doing a lot of research on this for your book. But I will say that this is certainly something that Matt and I bonded over very early in our friendship, I think. When I was doing research for the nautical book that I did, I obviously had a section on tattooing, and I went to speak to Matt to interview him to find out the information. He was incredibly helpful for me. And I'd come across this reference. I'd been looking at the designs of Schiaparelli, who created these incredible, in the late 1920s, these trompe-l'oeil sweater designs. And it's really one of the first times that we see like a jumper basically being a fashionable item. And the first one she did just had a bow around the neck. The second one she did was taken from the French sailors' uniforms, so it had sort of striped section and a sort of square collar at the back. But there was also this written mention of her having also created a jumper with tattoos like a sailor's chest on it. And I hadn't been able to find any images of this. And Matt and I, over the years, have done quite a few sort of nautically related events together. And we're always just like, where is this? Where is this jumper? Does this exist? Like, how can we find this? And it sort of escalated. And during the pandemic last year, we were both sort of doing various bits and pieces of research into it. Matt got another doctoral researcher involved in it as well. And then I think now you can pick it up from there, really, Matt, and talk about where you've gone with it.
Yeah, so we hadn't found any pictures of this, and then, you know, as more and more stuff has been over the years digitized, it's one of those things where I have a list of things that I want to find images of or information about, and I sort of, when I have a bit of procrastination, I go back to my list of things I haven't found yet, and this was always on the list of things I hadn't found. And actually this is as good as we've got. We've looked, and Jeanne Barnicot, who's a French tattoo historian, PhD student in France, has been looking as well. We haven't found any kind of drawings. We haven't found any photography, any adverts for it, but there are, you know, these kind of sketches. I think the left one is a photograph, actually, and then the two in the middle, these sketches from newspaper accounts. And basically the story is, so Schiaparelli claims at least to have gone down to the beach in Le Havre and basically got some tattoo designs, some authentic tattoo designs from the tattooer, and then she embroidered them on these kind of bathing suits. And these bathing suits, it's important to point out, would have been flesh colored, so very risque, very daring. Amber can tell you probably about the history of the bathing suit a bit more than I can, but these were basically part of, and you can see that on the left there, what Schiaparelli called her lizarding suits. So you'd wear these very sort of sexy, sort of nude appearance things to the beach or to the pool, and then you could sort of slip over a jacket or a tunic, and then head straight to the cocktail bar or to the restaurant. So they really were sort of second skins. The pitch was that you would be able to custom order these, and exactly as if you were getting tattooed, you could have the designs that you liked. And they really did cause a bit of a sensation. You know, they were mentioned in the newspapers in Australia, for example, like Vogue. Vogue New York were quite excited, but French Vogue were like kind of annoyed, not because they were tattoos, but because they were a bit garish.
Okay.
because they weren't very kind of chic.
I don't know. I think they look incredibly chic, I have to say.
Yeah.
So are they?
Sorry,
carry on.
I was going to say, so this is tattooing in fashion, going down the runway. They were apparently presented in the summer show in Paris in 1929 and in the Barcelona fashion shows as well. So this is again nearly 100 years ago, 1929. Kind of amazing, I think.
It's really amazing. And so to give a bit of context also on Schiaparelli, so like I mentioned, she began in the late 1920s with these trompe-l'oeil sweaters, but she went on to, in the 1930s, work very closely, collaborate with a series of surrealist artists as well. Salvador Dali most famously, but also people like Jean Cocteau as well, she collaborated with. And a lot of the designs that she created, people thought were incredibly questionable in terms of taste. Which I mean, firstly, she was very interested in swimwear. She actually I've just sent a link to a patent for some swimwear that she designed. But one of the dresses that she created with Salvador Dali is actually quite relevant. I don't know, I've not made this connection before actually, but they created this skeleton dress, which had exactly the same reaction. Like a lot of people were just like, that is the height of bad taste. Like, this is horrendous. Like, why would you create a dress that has the outline of, it's not even the outline, but it's like the padded outline of bones on it. It looks like you're wearing a skeleton. And there was just like a lot of people just could not understand why she was creating this. And I think that it's similar. It's interesting that that very close relationship with the body and of Shocking. She created this color that she called Shocking Pink. The Shocking was the name of her perfume as well. It's very much that kind of like reveling in how avant-garde she was, I think.
And it's a good gag, right? So the images on this slide, essentially the middle and the right-hand one, were jokes in the French press, like what next? Like in the middle, it's like someone showing off their leg painting. And on the right, it was a kind of joke, right, of these kind of nude, like what next? Like, are people going to be painted? Because there was this sort of real shock to the sensibilities of, young women starting to wear skimpier and skimpier clothing. It's like, what next? They're going to be painting on their bathing suits. So it's kind of a joke. And I wonder if the skeleton thing is like the next stage of that. Like, what next? Are they going to be showing off their bones? You know, it's kind of a good gag.
Yeah, definitely. But I'm interested. So did you say these were embroidered? Because the knitwear that she'd done previously was in tarsi. It was like knitted in, the pattern was knitted in. So was this actually embroidered on top?
Well, we don't know, right? Because we haven't actually found one. Some of the descriptions use the word embroidery, but I guess until we see one, we won't know. Whether one survives or not, we don't know. We've looked. Well, we've looked. We're still looking.
We'll never stop looking, Matt.
No, and it will come up gradually, like you say. You look all this time, and then something will appear on Google. When you Google it, it wasn't there before, so maybe you could be lucky. I think we've got another slide that shows some knitwear. If you could see the next one.
Yeah, so that that there's lots of this about, right? So when we sort of cracked, when Amber and I and Jeanne sat down to try and put this in context and see what happened, we found a lot more. Looking through French sources, we found like this, for example, a little kind of knitwear shoot from Marie Claire in 1940s, like showing that you can be like this sort of handsome pirate figure on the right, souvenir de toi, memory of you, all these. So these things that I think, again, were very viewed as we'll come on to, viewed as very shocking in the 1990s and very transgressive when people like Jean-Paul Gaultier were doing it, actually have these antecedents, right the way back into earlier eras.
I love the they kind of remind me a lot of, you see there's a couple of brands that are out now. I know there's a shop in Brighton and this brand called Collective, which uses a lot of sort of 40s and 50s motifs like this, which are sort of nautical and tattoo on their on their clothes today. So it kind of continues the line. I guess people look back and copy and see what was done before.
Well, there's this interesting, and this is sort of what I'm interested in what you're working on, Amber. There's this interesting kind of symbiosis, right, between fashion and the sea, because people kind of want to look like sailors and pirates or fishermen because there's this kind of romance and ruggedness and adventurousness and exoticism, and then that fits into fashion, and then that then heightens and perpetuates those myths and those cultural signifiers, and then we end up with this kind of feedback loop. And like tattooing's done that as well, right? Like the images that we find in nautical tattooing don't come from tattooing, they come from folk art, religious folk art, nautical folk arts of various kinds. They've become kind of known as tattoo designs, and then they enter the kind of cultural lexicon, the cultural understanding as tattoo images. And I think this is a really good example, right, where there's something kind of instantly significant about the immediate associations you have when you see those swallows, those banners, you know.
Definitely. I think we can, unless Amber's got anything to add to that one, nope.
No,
Okay.
no, just that I agree.
I adore these. These are like two of my favorite images. And I've seen this film too. And I remember looking at it and I was thinking, was it, because I remember Edith Head was a great costume designer, he used to make amazing stuff, but it's actually Howard Greer, the one with Ginger Rogers, and also what a fabulous Gloria Swanson one. Tell us more about these examples.
Well, we don't really know. At least I don't know very much about that Swanson dress. It was in a publicity still for a film called Father Takes a Wife. I'm sure it must be discoverable if I did more research, but I don't know who the designer was or anything. But again, it sort of fits into this really interesting moment of World War II, of patriotism, of female empowerment, and you know, there's something pretty sexy, isn't there, Amber, about like sailors and soldiers in general through fashion history, right?
Definitely. And it's reminding me, the Howard Greer ones there remind me very much of these sweaters that were featured in Life magazine by someone.
Yeah, they're on the next slide.
Oh, is it? Oh, the Susan. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, these are just incredible. They're so amazing. I love them. And this is sort of exactly how I imagine that those the Schiaparelli knitted swimwear would have looked if we could actually get a more, you know, a better image of them. I imagine this kind of thing, basically. But these crop up a lot on Instagram and things like that, because every now and again someone new will discover them and just be like, it's so amazing. I can't believe actually that no one's remade them yet. Maybe they have, but they're just so brilliant.
Yeah, they're a nod. I mean, I think what I love about these two, again, this is something pretty straightforward. If you go back to the previous slide as well, is that okay, Shahira? Like, you know, tattooing, I always say, you know, the images that people tattoo on their bodies don't need to be very complicated. They communicate quite straightforward, you know, emotional content. They're not very, or you know, they can be, but most tattoo designs have straightforwardly been quite, you know, iconographically quite strong and sort of, you know, meaningfully quite blunt. You know, you tattoo on your body the things you like, the things you hate, the things you love, and the things you want to have sex with.
Yeah.
And you know, like these kind of images of, like, you know, the pierced heart is such, you know, it's a really old image in Western iconography of, you know, comes from you know, Saint Sebastian perhaps, or, you know, it's a good image of like of pain and love and loss, and so it tells a very, again, quite kind of comprehensible romantic story quite quickly and boldly, and those associations are just, again, what people want to do with their clothing, right? They want to tell a story about who they are, how they're feeling, the person they want to be, the culture that they associate with, the kind of subcultures they associate with, and those are things that tattoos do as well.
Actually, yeah, when I was talking to my guest last week, Tirangatu, Natana, about Tomoko, and he was saying about in his culture that you basically wear your tattoos is wearing your soul on your skin. And I think clothing does that as well. I think, because like you said, we do want to represent, we do like to show our loyalties or what we like, and whether that's to be rebellious or to follow the trend, I think. I think at this stage, we could move on to look at some Izzy Miyaki, 1971. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, so, Amber, you could tell us something about this.
Well, I'm definitely interested to hear Matt's take on this. So this is often cited as kind of the first real moment of tattoos specifically being used in fashion. As we've just discussed, it's obviously not, but that's what the narrative has often become in sort of contemporary fashion writing. Basically, if you read a history of tattoos and fashion, this tends to be where it will begin. And I think one of the reasons it made such an impact is because of the cultural taboos that existed around tattoos in Japanese society, and I think still exist to a degree now, probably not as much as they were in the 70s, but certainly I lived in Japan for a bit at the end of the 90s, and it was certainly then was still very quite prevalent, this, you know, the real sort of taboo against tattooing. And I think a large part of that is because of these links with Yakuza, organized crime groups, which is what he was drawing on here. But we also see this real influence, of course, as well, of American subculture as well. There's an image of Jimi Hendrix that we're seeing here. It's is it Janis Joplin?
Yeah.
One of the two there as well. So it's like a real sort of hybrid, a real hybrid image. He's using this in terms of design techniques. He's using similar sort of design imagery to what we see on some of the Yakuza tattoos like here, but then really bringing in those sort of pop cultural or countercultural icons, I suppose, into it as well. So there's certainly a lot there to write about, I think, from any kind of cultural perspective. But Matt, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so Janis Joplin's super interesting. She's one of the kind of real early like tattoo celebrities. She was tattooed by Lyle Tuttle. I'm not sure if it's before or after this, around about this time. So Joplin herself is kind of this interesting figure in tattoo history. Yeah, so there is basically around the time that Miyaki was making this, there was also a lot of publicity around a guy called Dr. Fukushi, who'd been collecting basically preserved skins of Japanese tattooing for a few decades up until that point. And they were starting to become a bit more visible to the outside world. They were published a bit later than this, but around about this time by Ed Hardy in some of his publications, and kind of made Japanese tattooing really visible to the kind of contemporary Western trend world. But of course, like the other thing that's happening in the 70s is that, you know, things that are Oriental and are also getting pretty trendy in the United States, you know, Kung Fu movies in particular, right? Just as an aside, I saw someone at a supermarket the day who had a t-shirt on that said, "Surely not everyone was Kung Fu fighting." And I thought that was great. Anyway. So Japanese tattooing, you know, isn't that old actually as a tradition. This kind of style of Japanese tattooing only goes back to the kind of 18th century, as far as we can tell. It's very related to Japanese imagery of other kinds. Again, you know, woodblock printing. And yeah, as Amber said, was largely subcultural, and still it remains pretty taboo in Japan. Certainly it was pretty subcultural in the period around and up to and the immediate aftermath of the Second World War.
Can I just
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Like, just to ask you, I mean, that style of tattooing, when people associate with the sort of Yakuza, it was before them. I mean, it existed before them, so it wasn't.
Yeah. So tattooing was kind of a sort of fairly subcultural practice in medieval feudal Japan, and then essentially when Japan got encountered by the West, when the Americans showed up with gunboats in 1858, the Japanese decided they had to get modern very quickly, and they thought that tattooing basically made them look like a kind of old-fashioned society, and if they looked too old-fashioned, they'd be invaded and wiped out, colonized, basically. So tattooing was banned very quickly after the Meiji Restoration. So the first attempt to ban tattooing in Japan was in 1861. There's also a kind of indigenous set of traditions in Japan as well that's not this kind of tattooing, that's more Pacific looking, kind of black work on communities in Okinawa, for example. And so, yeah, basically that pushed tattooing into a subcultural space. And yeah, over the course of the 20th century, early 20th century, it became pretty much uniquely associated in Japan with crime.
Right.
And and actually now to get to the present day, the Yakuza aren't tattooing very much anymore because it sort of gives the game away a bit too much.
Yeah. Too associated with that. Let's move on to is it Kansai
Yamamoto?
Yes, please.
There you go. You can go back one more slide because you can see it in color.
Oh yeah.
Like in color. Yeah.
Just very quickly, actually, Matt mentioned the Okinawa. It's the Ainu, isn't it? I think people.
Yeah.
And there are some real visual similarities there between the kind of tattooing cultures, the tattooing aesthetic, and the robes, the kimono that's worn by the same people. That's a really interesting area to look into another time. Yeah.
It's so much, it's so rich actually, between the clothing and textiles and the tattooing. These are great.
Oh, I love this.
So I wanted to include this because a few years ago I did an event for the V&A with another dress historian, and she had just finished her thesis looking at the influence of Japan on the work of David Bowie, which of course was immense and covered so many different areas, not least of all his work with Lindsay Kemp and studying kabuki traditions, Japanese no theatre, like all of this, that has just huge influence. These are some of the designs created for him by Kansai Yamamoto, and the woman I did this event with, part of her thesis was that, again, through this bodysuit you could see the influence he was inspired by, that kind of Yakuza tattooing. Now, I don't think I know enough about the aesthetic of that style of tattooing to know whether that's viable. She certainly made a very convincing argument, but I mean, I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are, Matt. Also, what's interesting about this is that it was copied, I mean, very obviously copied, not in terms of like, oh God, it was copied, but Gautier basically recreated a version of this much more recently, and he's someone I think we're also going to be talking about in a bit, unless we run out of time.
Yes.
He's used tattoos a lot in his work. So there's that one, and there's also this one, Woodland Creatures, which I love, which I think was the very first thing that Kansai Yamamoto created for David Bowie. And Kansai Yamamoto was this incredible designer. He did the Space Samurai looks for Bowie. A lot of those incredibly literally iconic looks for Bowie in the early 70s were created by Kansai Yamamoto, very much inspired by his own Japanese culture. This one I love because it also sort of is a bit reminiscent of those the Schiaparelli lizard suits, I thought, as well. So we've sort of come full circle there.
It even goes back to the first things we saw that Matt showed. I think the animals on the skin and some of the sort of on the, what would you call that, where the button up is, that design looked like it was on some of the women's skirts or on the plate. I've seen that sort of design.
Yeah, and so a lot of, basically, I mean, the other thing that's interesting, that first one I think is probably more, if you want to make a connection to Japanese tattooing, it's probably more Ainu and traditional Japanese tattooing rather than contemporary. I mean, but what's super interesting about this as well is that a lot of tattooing, not just in Japan, but in lots of cultures, is often under clothing. You know, Arctic communities did tattoo, and obviously cultures in the Pacific as well tattooed the face and the hands. But in a lot of cultures, tattooing was really under the clothing and invisible. It would be kind of a more private thing. It would be not a kind of public display. The Scythians, for example, a lot of their tattooing would have been hidden most of the time because it's damn cold in Siberia. So there's this kind of visual equivalence actually with clothing, you know, even where it looks like you're wearing a shirt or a jacket or a sweater, just because of you're not often, or many cultural traditions aren't tattooing their faces and hands and necks. I'm
minded that we're kind of like our time is running down and there's so much more to say. I'd like to just what you're talking about there, and things hidden. So tattoos hidden on often beneath the clothing, especially for people's jobs, their positions, whether they were very rich or whatever. And to look at something that's very similar that Amber mentions in her book, nautical. Nautical chic, and I was really fascinated with it because it really reminded me of tattooing. It was the hidden thing. So the liberty cuffs. If you could bring up an image of that, I think it's a bit further down. And yeah, there we go. There's a little bit of an example there. What can you tell us about what was the liberty cuff?
I love these. So it's thought that this developed in the sort of late 19th century in the American Navy. And what's interesting about the very notion of uniform is that I think a lot of people who have to wear uniform as part of their profession are often very proud to be wearing a particular type of uniform, but also I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about this love of adornment, humanity's love of adornment. We also want to be different. We want to differentiate ourselves from other people. And the Liberty Cuff is a really perfect example of that. So what the Liberty Cuff is, and you can just about see it in these images, this one on the left is a Steve McQueen film where he wore them. It was essentially a sort of thick ribbon, silk ribbon with an embroidered design on it, and they would be sewn into the inside of the cuffs of your sailor top here, so that if you folded it back you could suddenly see it. Now this went against the regulations, the uniform regulations. So if you were on shore leave, I think it was only in about the 1970s that US sailors were actually allowed to wear civilian clothing when they were on shore leave. Before that, you were meant to be in uniform. It's, you're still very much a representative of the body that you're serving, etc., of your country. So any kind of violation of the uniform, if you were found with this, could come with quite hefty consequences. But that, of course, makes it a little bit more daring. It gives it that sort of, illicit thrill, I suppose. So quite often these, and hence liberty cuffs, right? Like you're free, you're on shore leave. And so a lot of these would be picked up when people were on campaigns in sort of Southeast Asia. A lot of them have dragons on them. A lot of them also have much more, sort of quite sort of traditional sea adjacent imagery, mermaids and things like that. And so it just kind of struck me that, as Matt is always talking about, you have to look at tattoos as part of visual culture as a whole.
Yeah,
I think there is a real sort of similarity here.
Definitely. And it's just, I mean, you can imagine you're going out and everybody looking the same, as you say, and it's just your like little rebellious tweet to the world, here I am, and that's me. And yeah, I mean, these are great. I love them.
This is one of the reasons why tattooing is so prevalent one of the theories as to why tattooing is so prevalent in, you know, in places like the military or in prisons. It's because you have two contradictory things going on at the same time. You want to kind of be part of the group, but you also want to stand out. Same with football players, you know, who will wear their kits. You kind of want to show that you're like your pals, so you'll get kind of tattooing to fit in, but you also want to stand out because you're in a uniform, you're in a, you know, so there's this kind of interesting paradoxical thing happening, and the Liberty cuffs work in the same way. Love it.
And you can also, I've come across them before when I used to work in a vintage shop where they have patches in the back as well, which you would never, that's something that like you could never actually show that off, like unless you weren't wearing the item. Yeah. But sometimes it's really beautiful embroidery, and sometimes it would be done by the sailors themselves as well, going back to that sailors sewing thing.
There's very similar stuff happening in Japan, right? So lots of the people who were tattooed in medieval Japan, early modern Japan, were like firemen, and lots of firemen coats had huge tattoo-like designs painted on the inside, and then they would turn them inside out for parade days.
Oh, it'd be lovely to see pictures of those. I mean, I think we've got so much stuff to talk about. We're really running out of time. It's mad. So let's quickly just jump on to Jean-Paul Gaultier and Martin Margiela. Is that right?
Yeah, Margiela. Yeah,
Margiela from from 1989 and then 2014. Quickly, because besides the fact that they're beautiful. Yeah.
This one I think is really interesting. So this is Margiela. Margiela had worked for Gaultier in the past, so it's interesting that Gaultier actually then picked up this idea after Margiela had done it a few years later. I think he was like 94 or something. But what I think is really interesting about this is that it again just goes right back to those Schiaparelli bodysuits, basically. Now, if we're thinking about tattoos literally in fashion, like in terms of tattoos on clothing, for me, I think they seem to always come in one of two ways. One of them is what Matt was discussing earlier, where you have these images that through romanticization, through repetitive use, they become known as tattoo symbols, like the anchor, like the swallow, things like that. So very much like those 1940s knitted sweaters that we were looking at with the tattoos and the swallows and the banner. So that's one way that you have tattoos in fashion, and that's some of the later Margiela collection, where he's got all of these almost 3D Sailor Jerry images going on. The other way that you have it is this way, where it's basically like sort of trompe-l'oeil. It's created like those Schiaparelli suits at the beginning, and she began her career with the interest in trompe-l'oeil, with that trick of the eye, which I think is what drew her to tattoo imagery. And that's what you're seeing here, and that's what you then see in some of the later, a lot of the stockings that we just had to really whiz through really quickly. You know, when you've got tattoos on tights, it's the same thing. It's like, it's a trompe-l'oeil effect. It's made to look like they're actually tattoos on the body.
Can we go to those, just a few shots?
Yeah, if you go back, I mean, so those
stockings.
This is something that literally so go back one more.
Yeah.
Keep
back.
Going one more.
Keep and again. A few more we see.
Oh, I love that. Back. There we go. That one. Forward. Forward one. There. One more. Forward.
Leg. Nope.
That one. Yay, that one. Okay. So this is on the right is this 1907 book called The Evolution of Dress. This is an image page, but on the subsequent page, the writer does actually say, like, tattoos will make your legs look, stockings will make it look like your legs are tattooed, by the way, because that was pretty hip in the late 19th and early 20th century. You know, you can get stockings like the ones on the left. These are like 19th century French stockings with these designs. But lots of discussion in you know, proto-fashion history, proto-fashion theory about this translucency effect. And if we go on to the next slide, which is, keep one more. Go to the one with Ginny Courtauld on it. Yeah, there we go, this one. So on the left is a woman, an aristocratic woman called Ginny Courtauld, an Italian-American who married into a pretty wealthy kind of landed family. And she's got, as you can see on her leg, this whacking great snake tattoo. It was pretty trendy if you went to Japan in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And here's a Stockings from the V&A collection from the same period, right? So again, that exact coincidence. If you don't want to go to Japan and you don't want to go through the pain and hassle of getting tattooed, although lots of tattooers at the time were injecting cocaine in you to ease the pain, so it might have been a great time. You could wear a stocking, and fashion writers, and fashion anthropologists were making this exact connection that we are today, again, over 100 years ago.
I mean, it's interesting with that too, because I remember in like the 2000s, friends of mine who do and admire and appreciate tattoos, but don't want to get one or don't want to have them, had the same kind of material that Amber was talking about. It's like translucent. I'm not sure of the name, but you mentioned it. And they were just like stocking sleeves for the arms, which had tattoo motifs. Mm-hmm. So it kind of looked like you had tattoos, but it's like clothing. So yeah.
It's interesting, the earlier ones, not these snake ones, but the ones we looked at the beginning, which were they like the 19th century ones, they're also drawing on a much earlier feature of stockings, like stockings in the 18th century and even maybe a little bit before, would always have like an embroidered section on the ankle called a clock. And that to me looks like it's sort of a sort of embellished clock, basically. So I think it would be really interesting to look more into that and to see if any of the designs that were initially on stockings ended up becoming tattoos at any point.
Well, a lot of women in particular seem to be in this period getting their legs tattooed more than their arms. Some women did get their arms tattooed, but lots of women in this period, lots of men are getting their arms tattooed. European men who are traveling to Japan, but lots of women seem to be getting their lower legs tattooed, and I'm sure that partly that's to keep them hidden because they weren't showing off their legs very much, but there is also this connection with stockings.
I mean, in terms of like models going down the catwalk, now they used to be like a blank canvas and the clothes were the thing, and now they already come decorated with self-expressive skin art, like everybody knows Cara Delevingne's Lion, and you mentioned as well before, Matt, about Zombie Boy who modeled
I mean, R.I.P. Rick Janest. I remember, so when he first appeared to the world on the internet back in the late 90s, there was lots of kind of like, tutting at him for ruining his life. And then he went on to have a pretty, he was a troubled man, Rick, but he had a pretty interesting life towards the end, traveled with Lady Gaga and walked for Mugler. And I think, that kind of using of tattooed models as well is something that goes back to at least the 80s, like probably before too. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but Gautier was certainly doing that in the 90s, like that kind of interest in also this is comes back to this point about tattooing in fashion or tattooing as fashion, is that no one wants their dad's tattoos, everyone wants their granddad's tattoos, right? So you'll go from like lots of tattoos to like no tattoos, lots of tattoos, no tattoos. And like fashion sped up in the 21st century. The cycles of fashion are much quicker. But that general rhythm still seems to be the case. Like we were talking about awful 90s tattoos right at the beginning, but they're the things that are like completely the most hip and trendy things right now. Just because everything in the 90s is trendy. So the real like hardcore, like cool kids are getting very, very spiky tribal again.
Okay.
Oh no.
Oh no. Are we old?
No, it makes me feel very old.
Yeah, it is the kids who are wrong.
Just a quick question on the designers like Gautier and you meant and Martin
Margiela.
Yeah, Margiela. Do you think when they were doing it, because it was like the 90s, 1989 and that, do you think they would have the same reaction now? Because people are much more aware or cultural sensitivities and things by taking lots of other people's cultures and just putting them out there. Do you think there would be a different response or not?
I think with the way Gautier did it, I'm not sure if we've actually seen the images of his 94 collection. I think there certainly would be. I mean,
You see them
a huge amount of Gautier's back catalogue can reasonably be described as cultural appropriation, and would absolutely not would have a very different reaction now if those creations were put down the runway. And I think that collection is just one of many. It's that, you know, it's a huge discussion, the discussion around cultural appropriation. Gautier's always came from a place of really respecting other cultures, wanting to honor them. Whether that makes it okay is another question, you know. But it certainly wasn't, he was never doing anything that denigrated other cultures, but it absolutely was cultural appropriation, and it absolutely was wearing other cultures like costume a lot of the time, which would absolutely not be acceptable were it done now. I think the Margiela one was slightly different, and his body of work over his career in general is not borrowed so much from so many other places, but I think Gautier certainly.
Cool.
It's complicated too, right? Because tattooing in Japan was never part of a big mainstream cultural tradition. You know, it didn't, and it didn't have the same relationship to spiritual beliefs, you know, specific cultural. It was, you know, Japanese tattooing is a lot more decorative, to really simplify things, because we're not doing it all about the history of Japanese tattooing, but like there's really something quite different, I think, about people getting Japanese tattoos, particularly by Japanese tattooers in this period, in a way that really was a kind of moment of cultural exchange, and then someone copying or appropriating tattooing from traditions where tattooing is earned, like, you know, like in New Zealand or Samoa or the Arctic or in Native American communities. You know, it's not the same. I would say, you know, tattooing is a medium, not a phenomenon. It often gets treated, and we've done a bit of that today, treated all tattooing as if it's the same thing, but really tattooing is just a way of putting ink in the skin. You know, it's the same. That's really all it is, and every kind of context, every iteration is different to some degree.
I'm going to have a look. I think there's a few questions. Oops. I think there's a few questions. Let's have a quick in the chat box. Oh, love the holiday chat. That was obviously from the top of the show. One from Kay Wagland. Thanks for your question, Kay. Have religious authorities responded to tattooing trends through the ages? Does religion play a part in tattooing? Speaking as an atheist. I mean, I know Matt told us last time about the whole pilgrims.
Yeah, so that's another talk really, but the short answer is yes, although we sort of really owe contemporary Western tattooing in some degree to pilgrims, Christian pilgrims getting tattooed by Coptic Christian tattooers in the Middle and Far East in the 17th century. And actually, to bring it back to the topic of fashion, actually, we have really good links from the 19th century with pilgrims going and tattooing just being part of the kind of souvenir trade of the pilgrim markets. So you could go and buy a kind of necklace or a pilgrim badge, as they called them, you know, a kind of pewter badge thing, or you could get tattooed. And there's this, again, real continuity of imageries. And the relationship between tattooing and various religious practices is complicated, but it's varied over time.
Okay, another question here from Harry Wilcox. And he says, in your opinion, would the bathing suits have been designed in order to make the person look tattooed, or would they have been simply used as motifs due to their style?
I think we actually sort of covered that a bit when we talked about, or I talked about my two different sort of theories of the uses of tattoo imagery. And I think for Schiaparelli in particular, it was her interest in trompe-l'oeil, in that trick of the eye, the sort of visual joke, basically. I think that's what drew her to it.
Okay, and I think
and certainly reviewers at the time wrote about them as if that, you know, as if they made people look tattooed. They were knitted in a particular kind of tan tone, I mean, probably wasn't as convincing as that kind of stuff that we saw in the 1980s, but you know, that was the gag and that was the vibe, and that was the kind of sexual liberatory risque move that Schiaparelli was trying to make, I think.
Is there time to just get one last to tell us a little bit about Ed Hardy and his collaboration?
Yeah, so I can take that. Like, so Ed Hardy is like the most important tattooer of the 20th century, in my opinion. Certainly of the latter half of the 20th century. Ed was one of, he really was not just a kind of really interesting bridge between a kind of pre-war period of tattooing in the US and the modern period, because he grew up in California, but he also, he was a real historian, and he gathered a lot of images and from before anyone else was, or before many people were. He was publishing books and publishing journals. He's a very smart and very sort of academically minded guy. So he was really kind of publishing and exposing the world to loads of stuff in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, as lots of tattooers often say, tattooing hasn't got a retirement plan. And in the early 2000s, after a collaboration with another kind of legend of American folk or popular folk culture, Von Dutch, the hot rod pinstriper, the designer Christian Audiger approached Ed Hardy and said, "Can I use some of your designs for a fashion line?" And it got to the point, I think, for a while that people that got so popular and so kind of iconic of that first decade of the 21st century that loads of people didn't even know Ed Hardy was a real person, or that Von Dutch was a real person, let alone a tattooer. It got very overexposed, and Ed ended up suing Audiger, as I understand it, because the brand produced more things. There was perfume bottles and phone cases and all that kind of stuff, which wasn't in the original license agreement. But I think if any other tattooists had done that, I think they would have been really viewed as some kind of sellout. And certainly people did make that accusation against Ed, but he earned the right to do that. He pushed tattooing into a very different popular space anyway. And I don't know, again, I wonder if they're going to come back into fashion. I've probably still got a Christian Audiger shirt somewhere. I think it's covered in paint from using it as a painting shirt.
I mean, it's interesting actually, just on that fashion and bringing tattoos. My guest last week, he's making scarves or designing scarves for Hermes, and he's putting his sort of Maori designs that he's created. So depending on how you wear the scarf, what design will show up and what it means and the different things. And it's, a very beautiful idea, I think. So it continues, it can be, if it's not sort of like you just mentioned there, just on every single thing, and it becomes overloaded, saturated, I guess, the market. So it becomes kind of, people aren't so interested. When you have it and when it's beautiful, it can be, stunning. It's really nice to see. Guys, we've kind of run out of time. I am so sorry about that to the people listening and watching as well, because we have two great people here with so much knowledge, and we had lots of other slides and people to talk about, but I think we've kind of covered the main people here tonight. Anything else to add before we say goodbye?
No, well, thank you for inviting me and us. I guess I don't want to speak for Amber, but it's always good to talk. And this was nice. This is really good. I've learned so much from Amber over the years that I've known her, and it's nice to kind of talk about something that's a bit different to stuff I normally talk about. And I hope the big idea underneath all of this is that tattooing is connected to culture, not separate from it. Which again seems quite obvious, but it's not often how psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists have understood tattooing. And I think pointing out that these impulses go back into, are present in every culture, that go back a long way, tells us something really interesting about what we have in common, rather than what divides us as human beings, I think.
I think that's a great message to end on. Yeah,
completely
agree. Yeah.
And it kind of fits with the top as well. How do we see this? We see it tattoos and fashion are as representative as anything else in museums to tell us about our culture and inform us. So thank you so much to Amber and Matt. And if you want to check out Amber's book, by the way, it's called Nautical Chic, and it's a really interesting read and a very beautiful book. So, and I'd also like to thank Shahira for doing all this.
Yeah, thanks, Shahira.
Thank you. Thanks. Also, here's a link to the podcast that I did with Matt, if anyone wants to listen to that, where we talk much more about tattoos, nautical tattoos specifically.
And I have finally got a book coming out next year. I know I've been publishing a book for a decade. I finally got a book coming out next year. That's not the book I've been writing for a decade. It's a different book, but it is nearly finished, which includes some of the stuff on the Scythians and the Pazoics, loads of stuff on Schiaparelli, lots of other things on this.
Well, let us know when it's out, because we will get it into the museum and make sure it's there. I would like a copy myself anyway. And just to let you know, next week we have Dr. Rebecca Owens, and also the tattoo artist Brownie, and there we're going to be talking more about the psychology of tattooing. And for that, thank you very much and have a really nice evening. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.